By 1945, the average German civilian was living on fewer than 1,000 calories a day. Mothers boiled wallpaper paste for the starch. Children chewed on pine bark and called it bread. The meals on this list are not nostalgia. They are evidence of what hunger does to a nation when the bombs stop falling, but the food does not come back. Number 17 on this list was so desperate that Allied soldiers who witnessed it could not believe a European country had sunk that low. And number 3 was eaten by millions of Germans well into 1948, 3 full years after the war ended. These 25 meals tell the story of survival at its most raw. Before we begin, subscribe, because this list will change how you think about what people will eat when they have no other choice. Number 25. Turnip bread. When wheat vanished from German bakeries in the winter of 1916, and again during the final years of World War II, the turnip stepped in as the reluctant savior of the German loaf. Housewives grated raw turnips, squeezed out the moisture through cloth, and mixed the pulp with whatever flour could be found, sometimes rye, sometimes ground barley, and often sawdust stretched with a handful of grain. The loaves that came out of the oven were dense, gray, and wet in the center. They smelled of earth and tasted of nothing you would call bread, but they filled stomachs. During the Steck-Reuben winter, the infamous turnip winter from 1916 to 1917, turnips replaced nearly every staple in the German diet. That memory haunted the nation so deeply that when food supplies collapsed again in 1944, women who remembered the First War already knew what to do. They grated, they squeezed, they baked, and their children ate without complaint because there was nothing else. Number 24. Watered soup with bone fragments. Soup kitchens in bombed-out cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne served thousands of civilians every day by 1945. But the soup was barely soup. Municipal cooks boiled animal bones that had already been boiled 3 or 4 times, extracting whatever traces of marrow and fat remained. The liquid was gray and thin, sometimes with a few shreds of cabbage or a single potato cut into pieces so small each bowl might contain 1 sliver. Women lined up for hours in the freezing cold, holding dented pots and tin cans. Children stood beside them, silent, learning patience before they learned to read. The bones were often splintered and sharp, and people picked through their bowls carefully. This was not a meal. It was a ritual of endurance, but it kept people alive when the alternative was nothing at all. Number 23. Kartoffelpuffer from frozen potatoes. Potato pancakes had been a beloved German dish for centuries, but the wartime version bore little resemblance to the golden, crispy cakes served at peacetime tables. By late 1944, potatoes stored in cellars had frozen and thawed repeatedly, turning black and mushy, with a sour smell that filled the kitchen. Mothers grated these half-rotten potatoes anyway, mixed in a spoonful of flour if they had it, sometimes a pinch of salt, and fried the patties in whatever fat could be scraped together. Often that meant a thin film of lard saved from weeks earlier, barely enough to keep the pancake from welding itself to the cast iron pan. The result was gray, soggy, and faintly sweet from the starch breaking down. Children ate them with their hands, burning their fingers because waiting meant someone else might take their share. Number 22. Ersatz coffee from roasted acorns. Real coffee had disappeared from German shelves as early as 1939. By 1943, even the official ersatz blends made from roasted barley and chicory were scarce. So women foraged. Acorns were gathered from parks and forests, shelled, chopped, and roasted in dry pans over low heat until they turned dark brown. Ground into a coarse powder and boiled with water, the result was bitter and tannic, nothing like coffee, but it was hot and dark and gave the illusion of normalcy. Some families mixed in roasted dandelion roots or dried beetroot shavings to soften the bitterness. The ritual mattered as much as the taste. Sitting at the table with something warm in a cup meant the day still had structure. It meant the household had not yet come apart. Mothers served acorn coffee to their children with a spoonful of saccharin, the only sweetener left, and pretended everything was fine. Number 21st. Brennesselsuppe, stinging nettle soup. When vegetables could no longer be bought at any price, German women walked into fields and along canal banks wearing thick gloves, harvesting stinging nettles by the armful. The leaves were boiled until the sting cooked out, then mashed into a thin soup with water, salt, and, if luck held, a single diced potato. Nettle soup was green, earthy, and surprisingly nutritious. The plant carried iron, calcium, and vitamins that the wartime diet desperately lacked. Children who ate it complained less about being tired. Mothers who knew their botany also gathered sorrel, dandelion greens, and wild garlic to throw into the pot. This was not folk tradition or grandmother's wisdom passed down for charm. This was survival botany. Women traded tips about which weeds were safe and which would make you sick, information that passed through refugee columns and air raid shelters like currency. Number 20. Bread spread with mustard. When butter, lard, margarine, and even jam had vanished from the ration cards, bread needed something on it to make it go down. Mustard was one of the few condiments still occasionally available, partly because the ingredients were simple, and partly because it was not considered a priority item worth hoarding. Mothers spread a thin layer of sharp German mustard on dark rye bread and handed it to their children for Abendbrot, the traditional evening bread meal. The mustard burned the tongue and made the eyes water, but it gave the illusion of flavor on bread that was often stale or adulterated with fillers. Some families used mustard on bread for weeks at a stretch, the same jar lasting because so little was used each time. It was not a meal anyone would choose, but it was a meal. And in Germany between 1944 and 1948, that distinction was the only one that mattered. Number 19. Kohlrüben Eintopf, rutabaga stew. The one-pot stew, or Eintopf, had been a staple of German kitchens for generations, but the wartime version was stripped down to almost nothing. A single rutabaga, diced and boiled in water with salt. No meat, no fat, no herbs. Sometimes an onion if one could be found. The Nazis had actually promoted Eintopfsonntag, one-pot Sunday, as a propaganda tool early in the war, encouraging families to eat simple stews and donate the savings to the war effort. By 1945, the propaganda was irrelevant. One-pot meals were not a patriotic choice. They were the only option. Families ate rutabaga stew for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The taste became so associated with misery that an entire generation of Germans refused to eat rutabaga for the rest of their lives. Their children and grandchildren grew up never seeing the vegetable in the kitchen, the trauma of hunger literally erasing a food from the national diet. Number 18. Dried bread reconstituted in water. When bread went stale, and in a country where fresh baking required flour, yeast, and fuel that were all rationed or gone, mothers soaked the hardened crusts in water until they turned soft. Sometimes warm water, sometimes cold, depending on whether fuel could be spared. The result was a porridge-like mush that tasted of nothing but wet grain. Some women added a pinch of sugar or a few drops of vinegar to give it character. Children ate it from bowls with spoons, the bread disintegrating into a gray paste that clung to the enamel. In refugee camps across the occupied zones after 1945, this was breakfast for millions. Aid workers documented the practice with quiet horror, noting that it provided almost no nutritional value but filled the stomach enough to stop the cramping. It was the meal of last resort before there was no meal at all. Number 17. Soup made from leather scraps. This is the entry that Allied soldiers could not believe. In the final months of the war and the desperate first year of peace, Reports came from Berlin, Breslau, and other besieged or destroyed cities of civilians boiling strips of leather to make broth. Old belts, boot tongues, handbag straps, anything made from untreated animal hide was thrown into pots of boiling water to try to extract calories. The leather did not dissolve. It softened into a chewy, tasteless mass that sat in gray water, but the collagen from the hide released a faint protein into the liquid, and starving people drank it. American and British journalists who entered Germany in the spring of 1945 documented these accounts. Some dismissed them as exaggeration. Others saw the evidence firsthand, pots in bombed-out kitchens with strips of leather still floating in cold water. This was not cuisine. It was the outer edge of human desperation. Number 16. Falscher Hase, false rabbit. Meatloaf made without meat. The original Falscher Hase was already a thrifty dish, stretching ground pork and beef with breadcrumbs and eggs into a loaf shaped like a rabbit. By 1944, the wartime version contained no meat at all. Women mixed stale bread soaked in water with grated onion, a spoonful of flour, and whatever seasoning they could find. They shaped the mass into a loaf and baked it. Some added ground lentils or mashed beans when available. The name became a bitter joke. False rabbit had always been false. Now it was false meatloaf too, but the shape mattered. Serving something that looked like a proper main course, something that sat in the center of the table with a form and a name, preserved a sense of order. Families sat around it and ate slices as if it were a Sunday roast. The pretense was part of the survival. Number 15. Sugar beet syrup on everything. When sugar, honey, and jam were gone, German housewives turned to Zuckerrübensyrup, a thick, dark syrup boiled down from sugar beets. Farmers in the Rhineland had produced it for centuries, but during the war it became a universal sweetener, spread on bread, stirred into ersatz coffee, drizzled over porridge, and fed to infants as a calorie supplement. The taste was intensely sweet, with a faintly metallic, earthy undertone. Children loved it because sweetness was so rare that even an imperfect version felt like a holiday. Mothers traded cigarettes and clothing for jars of the stuff on the black market. A single liter could last a family 2 weeks if rationed carefully. In the hunger years from 1945 to 1948, Zuckerrübensyrup was sometimes the only source of quick energy available. It kept blood sugar from crashing, kept children from fainting in school, and kept mothers standing long enough to find the next meal. Number 14. Doergemüse, life-saving dehydrated vegetable flakes. Doergemüse began as dried vegetable rations the German military developed for soldiers on the front. They were compressed flakes of cabbage, carrot, onion, and potato that could be rehydrated with boiling water. When supply lines collapsed and military stockpiles were looted or distributed to civilians, these dried flakes became a kitchen staple. Women boiled them into soups and stews that tasted of almost nothing because the dehydration process stripped out most flavor along with the moisture. But they contained calories and some vitamins, and they stored almost indefinitely. Families hoarded bags of Doergemüse the way they might hoard gold. One bag meant a week of meals. The flakes swelled in hot water to several times their size, creating the illusion of a full pot from a handful of dried scraps. Children called it Zauberessen, magic food, because it seemed to multiply. The magic, of course, was mostly water. Number 13. Horse meat stew. When cattle, pigs, and sheep had been requisitioned for the military or slaughtered to survive the previous winter, horses became the last large source of animal protein available to German civilians. Draft horses killed by bombs, old farm horses too weak to work, and military horses wounded in the retreat were all butchered. Horse meat appeared in soups and stews across Germany by 1944. The meat was dark, lean, and slightly sweet, tougher than beef, and requiring long, slow cooking to become edible. Mothers braised it with onions and whatever root vegetables they had, stretching a single portion to feed the family. There was no stigma. People who had never considered eating horse before the war did so without hesitation. Hunger dissolves taboos faster than any argument. After the war, horse butcher shops operated openly in German cities well into the 1950s, a visible reminder of the years when survival outranked preference. Number 12. Kartoffelschalen-Suppe, potato peel soup. When whole potatoes became too valuable to eat casually, the peels became a meal of their own. Women collected potato skins, sometimes their own, sometimes begged from neighbors or gathered from restaurant waste bins, and boiled them into a thin broth. The peels still carried starch and a trace of vitamins beneath the skin. Boiled long enough, they softened into a soup that was starchy, faintly earthy, and desperately bland. Some women added salt, some added a bay leaf if one could be found. Most added nothing because there was nothing to add. In the winter of 1946 to 1947, the so-called Hunger Winter, potato peel soup was served in school canteens across the British and American occupation zones. Teachers watched children drink it in silence, knowing it would not keep them warm through the afternoon. But it was all there was. Number 11. Muck fuck. Ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. Before acorns and before dandelion roots, the most common coffee substitute in wartime Germany was muck's fuck, a word likely derived from the French phrase mocha faux, meaning false mocha. It was made from roasted barley, rye, or chicory root, ground and brewed like real coffee. The taste was thin and malty, without the bitterness or the caffeine kick that made real coffee essential. But Germans drank it by the gallon. It was hot. It was familiar. It meant the morning still had a beginning. Factories produced muckafuck on an industrial scale, and ration cards allocated small amounts per household each month. Women brewed it weak to stretch the supply, sometimes reusing the grounds a second time. The second brew was little more than brown water, but the cup went to the table and the day began. That small rhythm held families together when everything else was falling apart. Number 10. Steck Reuben marmalade, turnip jam. When fruit was unavailable and sugar was rationed down to grams per week, housewives cooked turnips with water and a tiny amount of saccharin until the mixture broke down into a sticky Swedish paste. Some added a drop of lemon essence or synthetic vanilla flavoring to disguise the taste. Spread on bread, it served as jam for children who had never tasted real strawberry preserves. The texture was grainy and the flavor was unmistakably vegetable, but with enough sweetener, it crossed the threshold into edible. Mothers told children it was special jam, and small children believed them because they had no frame of reference. Older children knew the truth and ate in silence. Turnip jam appeared in German wartime cookbooks published by the government, presented with illustrations and cheerful instructions as if it were a perfectly normal recipe. The gap between the illustrations and the reality told the whole story of the home front. Number 9. Blutwurst, made from whatever blood was available. Traditional German blood sausage used pork blood, back fat, barley, and careful seasoning. The wartime version used whatever blood the slaughterhouse had on hand, sometimes cow, sometimes horse, sometimes mixed. It was packed into casings with a grain filler and a heavy hand of salt to mask off flavors. By 1944, fresh blutwurst was one of the few animal protein sources that still appeared at butcher counters, though the lines stretched around the block and supplies ran out within the hour. Mothers fried slices for dinner, the dark sausage crisping at the edges, filling the kitchen with a heavy iron smell. Children ate it because it was there and because their bodies craved the iron and the calories it provided. There was no discussion of taste. Taste had become irrelevant somewhere around 1943. What mattered was whether it kept you standing until tomorrow. Number 8. Quark stretched with water. Quark, the soft fresh cheese that had been a cornerstone of German breakfasts, became impossibly scarce as dairy herds were slaughtered and farms destroyed. When a family did obtain a small portion, the instinct was to stretch it. Mothers mixed quark with water, sometimes half and half, until it became a thin, sour cream barely thick enough to spread on bread. Some added chives or a pinch of salt. Some stirred in mashed potato to give it body. The result was a pale, watery paste that bore almost no resemblance to the rich, tangy quark of peacetime. But it went on bread. It counted as a meal. And every spoonful of the real thing that could be stretched into 2 spoonfuls meant one more breakfast before the jar was empty. Number 7. Graupen Supi E, barley soup. When meat was gone and vegetables were scarce, pearl barley became the foundation of the German survival pot. Women boiled barley in water for hours until the grains swelled and burst, releasing their starch into the liquid and creating a thick, porridge-like soup. A single cup of dry barley could produce a liter of soup. Add salt and an onion, and you had dinner. Barley was one of the last grains still available in quantity because it was considered animal feed, beneath the dignity of a proper German table in peacetime. During the war, dignity was the first luxury to go. Graupensuppe appeared at every meal in some households, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the same pot simmering on the stove for days. The monotony was crushing. But monotony was better than starvation, and families who had barley counted themselves fortunate. Number 6. Brat soupe, bread soup. Stale bread, crumbled into boiling water with a pinch of salt, sometimes a crack of pepper, cooked until it dissolved into a thick gray porridge. This was the meal of the bombed-out cities, eaten by families sheltering in basements and cellars while the world exploded above them. Bread soup required almost nothing. A heel of bread, water, heat. It was warm, it was filling, and it could be made in a pot over a candle if the stove had been destroyed. Refugee accounts from 1945 describe eating bratsuppe for weeks straight, the taste becoming so familiar it stopped registering. Some women added a scraping of onion or a spoonful of vinegar to break the monotony. Most did not bother. The soup's only purpose was to stop the pain in the stomach long enough to sleep. And in the ruins of Germany, sleep was the second most precious resource after food itself. Number 5. Roasted dandelion root as vegetable. Beyond its use as a coffee substitute, the dandelion root was dug up, scrubbed, sliced, and roasted as a vegetable side dish. Women discovered that slow roasting in a dry oven caramelized the natural sugars in the root, producing something faintly sweet and almost nutty. Sliced thin and roasted until crisp, dandelion roots could pass for a poor cousin of roasted parsnip. Children ate them with their fingers. In the spring of 1945, when stored food had run out and the new growing season had not yet begun, dandelion roots were among the few things still available in quantity. Parks, roadsides, bombed lots, and rubble fields all produced dandelions. Women with sharp knives and empty stomachs harvested them daily. The plant that peacetime gardeners considered a weed became, for one desperate season, the most important vegetable in Germany. Number 4. Mehlsuppe, flour soup. When nothing else was left, not even stale bread or barley, a spoonful of flour stirred into boiling water created the most basic soup imaginable. Some recipes called it white soup, others simply called it hunger. 1 tablespoon of flour, 1 cup of water, salt if available. The flour thickened the water into a paste that coated the mouth and sat heavy in the stomach, mimicking fullness without providing much nutrition. In the besieged cities of the Eastern Front, Mehlsuppe was documented as the primary food of civilians during the final weeks of the war. Women made it for their children and then did not eat themselves, giving their portion to the youngest. The mathematics of starvation were performed silently at every table, 1 spoonful of flour per person per meal. When the flour ran out, there was nothing left to calculate. After the surrender, with Germany's cities reduced to mountains of rubble, the Trümmerfrauen, rubble women who cleared the debris, began planting vegetable gardens in the bombed-out lots. Between shattered bricks and twisted steel, they grew potatoes, cabbages, and carrots in soil contaminated with ash and dust. The meals they cooked from these gardens were simple: boiled potatoes, cabbage soup, and raw carrots eaten straight from the ground, wiped on an apron. There was no seasoning, no fat, no protein, but the food was real, grown by their own hands from the destruction around them. This practice continued well into 1948, 3 years after the war ended, because the official rations provided by the Allied occupation authorities were not enough to survive on. The rubble gardens were not nostalgia. They were the difference between living and dying. And the women who tended them became the quiet, unsung foundation of Germany's reconstruction. Number 2. Kriegsbrot, war bread. The official wartime loaf, mandated by the German government, was a dense, dark brick made from rye flour, stretched with potato flour, sawdust, and ground straw. Regulations specified the exact percentages of filler permitted, and as the war progressed, the percentage of actual grain decreased while the fillers increased. By 1945, Kriegsbrot was more filler than bread. It was heavy, gummy, and tasted of wood pulp. It stuck to the roof of your mouth and sat in the stomach like cement. But it was the one food item that nearly every German had access to throughout the war, distributed through ration cards and bakery queues. Mothers sliced it thin to make the loaf last. Fathers ate it without expression. Children learned to chew slowly, because chewing was the only way to make a meal feel longer. Kriegsbrot was not food, it was policy. A government's calculation of exactly how little a human being could eat and still remain functional. And for millions of Germans, it was the single most consumed item of the entire war. Number 1. Nothing. The empty plate. The harshest meal of all was no meal. By the spring of 1945 and through the hunger winter of 1946 to 1947, millions of German civilians ate nothing for days at a stretch. Not because they chose to fast, but because there was literally no food available. Ration cards promised 1,500 calories per day, but actual distribution often delivered fewer than 800. In some areas, it delivered nothing at all. Mothers put children to bed early because sleeping children do not ask for food. Fathers left the house to walk the streets, not to find anything, but because the sight of hungry children they could not feed was unbearable. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of German civilians died of starvation or malnutrition-related disease between 1945 and 1948. The empty plate sat on the table as a daily accusation. It was the final meal on this list because it required no recipe, no preparation, and no ingredient except endurance. It was the meal that an entire nation prayed they would never have to eat again. These 25 entries trace the arc of desperation, from resourcefulness to ruin. The early items on this list show ingenuity, women who could make something from almost nothing, stretching turnips into bread, nettles into soup, acorns into coffee. But as the numbers climb, the ingenuity runs out. There is no clever trick for leather broth. There is no grandmother's wisdom for flour stirred into water. What remains is a record of what hunger does when it has nothing left to work with. Share this with someone who has never thought about where their next meal comes from. These stories deserve to be remembered, not for the recipes, but for the people who survived them.